Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining the Nature Partnership, the Nature Working Group discussion. So, thank you, Jamie. Awesome. We need water. That seems to be a theme at the moment in Oxfordshire. If anybody's seen the floods recently, thank you for that. My name is Rachel Wileman. Can you hear me okay? I'm Director of Planning, Environment and Climate Change at Oxfordshire County Council. Really pleased to see you all here in this group, the best group, of course, focusing around nature. And I'm very pleased to introduce our panel, our three speakers. We've got about an hour, so I'll move on. But just very briefly, in terms of my role at Oxfordshire County Council, we have statutory responsibilities to help around nature recovery. We are a nature recovery authority and we're working in partnership, not least with the Local Nature Partnership on the Local Nature Recovery Strategy. We are lead local flood authority and work with partners around managing flood risk and sustainable drainage. We are also the Minerals and Waste Planning Authority. So we look very much at nature conservation around the restoration and conservation of open areas to do with following mineral extraction. We're also the Waste Disposal Authority. We work a lot in rural areas, perhaps not as much as we would like to with some of the rural community groups, but we would really hope that we can use this platform today to get more partnership work going and to work with you a lot more around nature recovery. It's a very key priority for the County Council. So we do have an environment policy statement. If you go onto the internet, you'll find that. And these are environment principles by which we aim to support what we do as a county council. We have a target for 20% biodiversity net gain. We have tree policies, virgin vegetation policies to inform what we do around the highways. So we are very active as a partner for nature recovery and very keen to work with you across the sectors in taking that work forward. So thank you for joining us and do come in. I'm going to move straight into the speakers because we really do want to hear from our fantastic speakers this afternoon. Matt Whitney will start us off. So Matt is the head of Oxfordshire's Local Nature Partnership. So we work quite closely already with Matt. Matt manages the partnership which seeks to integrate nature into decision-making across all policy sectors. Matt led on the development of the Oxfordshire Nature Finance Strategy, which describes a framework for natural capital investment. And Matt wishes to strengthen the links between nature finance and decarbonisation finance to address the twin climate and ecological emergencies simultaneously. So Matt, over to you.
Thanks very much. Shall I stand here? There we go. It's good. There we go. Yeah, so I'm Matt, Local Nature Partnership Manager. Unlike previous speakers, I don't have a first from Oxford in PPE. I haven't written any course textbooks, and nor do I know what utility curves are. I do know a little bit about how private money is and can be used to stimulate and achieve nature recovery. And that's what I'm going to hope to talk to you about today. Before going through my slide deck, actually, I wanted to pick up on some comments that we've had from other speakers. We heard from Nick Ayres at the start that less repayable capital investment is required for nature than for some of the other sectors. That's right. And therefore, a lot of this stuff we're talking about in nature finance is transactional. It's about nature markets and doing deals rather than necessarily needing repayable finance for all of it, although that will, of course, be necessary in some places. Alex Money said that partnerships are needed to think through these things, and it won't be bright ideas thought up in people's dorm rooms. And yeah, we are a partnership, and I'll describe how that works in a moment. The Legal and General chap said some of this stuff's quite difficult. And there'll be my penultimate slide will show you how difficult we think the nature market kind of ecosystem is. And then a final comment from Alex Money, if we can't do it in Oxfordshire, where can we do it? Because of the kind of intellectual and organisational and natural and financial capital that we have in this county. So I'll get on with what I'm supposed to be talking about. I'll explain why I think we need nature finance in Oxfordshire. I'll explain what I understand and what the Oxfordshire Local Nature Partnership understands by nature finance. I'll talk about the Oxfordshire specific approach. And if there's time at the end, which there may or may not be, I'll talk about specifically our nature-based carbon sequestration projects that we're working on. So why do we need nature finance? This stuff won't be new to you. The UK is underperforming globally on nature. We're in the bottom decile for nature intactness across the world. That's not very good. Government understand this, and therefore they've brought forward the Environment Act 21, which includes in it a requirement for the production of local nature recovery strategies. However, we don't have the hooks that we need to deliver them. ELM and agricultural subsidies were supposed to be linked to LNRS. They're not. Local development plans, the local plans of the local authorities were supposed to be linked strongly to LNRS. That's insufficient. So we've only got a 1.2 multiplier within the dephrometric, if that makes sense to any of you here, which isn't a very strong hook for delivering these things. So as Sophus excellently explained earlier, Oxfordshire needs nearly £1 billion to deliver our nature recovery aims. And that doesn't take into account a lot of the transaction costs and facilitation costs around doing nature recovery. So it's going to be more than that. And that tallies with the national number that GFI came up with, which is £6 billion a year. Bear in mind, that's 2021 number, which is a few years ago now. We have 6 harvests left till 2030. So that £6 billion per year is now more than that. And then the final point here, which is why this event is so well designed and conceived, is that nature recovery is vital to addressing climate change. And you can turn that sentence around as well. Addressing climate change is vital to nature recovery. So it's good we're having these conversations in the same place. What is nature finance? Again, Sophus has already done part of this earlier, but I understand that it's private money paying for nature recovery and nature-based solutions. For me, nature recovery is about biodiversity, ecological connectivity, wildlife and habitats, whereas nature-based solutions is all the things that nature provides to society, the economy and the climate. So in my conception of nature finance, it's often tokenized. So a piece of land can, by managing it or using it differently, we can create an environmental uplift. That uplift can be tokenized and then sold by the owner or the manager of that land to somebody who wants to buy it. And I describe here a couple of the different markets in which those transactions take place. Some are mandatory, and for BNG, it's a compliance market. Some are voluntary, if we think about net zero commitments. And in the bottom table are some thoughts around the drivers of why we would get involved in this stuff. And crucially on the right-hand side, on the supply side, why farm businesses and landowners would get involved in this. And there's broadly 2 things there. One of them is that farming is not making loads of money. Let's put it like that. BPS, the single farm payment, will be gone by 2027, which leaves a massive hole in most farm businesses, coupled with the high price of inputs and continuing squeezing from supermarkets, etc. There's a requirement, more and more farmers and landowners are identifying the need to diversify their land management business, their farm business. And natural capital markets is one way in which they can do that. The other bit is about farmers know they need to manage the land better. Despite the fact that intensive agriculture has been one of the main causes of the nature decline, that's not farmers' fault, that's policymakers' fault. Farmers have been responding to the policy signals that they've been given. You know, farmers know better than anybody the importance of soil health and managing the land better for nature and want to do so. So this is what I was supposed to be talking about for the whole talk. The Oxfordshire Nature Finance Strategy. Calling it a strategy is perhaps a misnomer, but what this does is it describes a framework for developing. Part of it is about high integrity offset market. And we lay out a number of principles that the market should demonstrate and exhibit. The first, I've picked out a couple here. First is that offsetting should be a last resort. We want businesses and organisations to stop emitting carbon, for instance, and stop damaging nature in the first place before thinking about offsetting any residual impacts. From one of our previous speakers, those of you paying attention will be familiar with the wording of distributed by design. At the moment, natural capital markets are primarily accessible to larger landowning enterprises, affluent landowners, if you like. And if we're to spatially prioritise to achieve nature recovery, to do the best nature intervention in the best place with the best outcome, we need to spatially prioritise. And that means we need all farmers and landowners to be able to access these markets. Some will need support in doing so. Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund is one way in which that can be done. Can we conceive of an Oxfordshire NERF? Is an idea that's going around. And then aligned to the LNRS priorities and objectives, that this process of developing the local nature recovery strategy is crucial for Oxfordshire. We want to make sure that we can make private money work to help deliver those priorities and objectives. But that's offsetting, and this isn't just about offsetting. Offsetting is necessarily mitigating harm and compensating for harm done elsewhere. We need to move to a nature positive future. One way of doing that is through voluntary biodiversity credits. We see this as a very emerging and untested space, but one that has real potential, particularly given, I'm not going to explain TNFD and the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures now, but just to say that some businesses are increasingly realizing that they have material risks and dependencies in a certain landscape, and they want to address those. So we're about to embark on a piece of work that will explore which businesses have risks and dependencies in Oxfordshire's natural environment and present those businesses with ways in which they can address them by paying for environmental uplift. And that has big benefits to the business as well as to nature in Oxfordshire. I said some of this stuff is a bit complicated, isn't it? I'm not going to explain all of this, but the main point I want to get across is that there's lots of different functions within a nature market that need to be performed. They can be performed by single organisations, by multiple organisations. Really, it's going to take the whole local nature partnership and wider to make this stuff work. Get to grips with this, I suggest you visit the LNP website to look at it in more detail. As I say, I'm not going to explain it all now, but I think the next slide is probably the most important for the purposes of explaining the LNP and how we work on nature finance. We're a partnership, and this slide just shows if we can't do it in Oxfordshire, where can we do it? We've got Trust for Oxfordshire's Environment on there. Show me an organisation with more experience in biodiversity net gain. We've got Three Keel. Show me somebody who's better set up to deliver on TNFD for businesses. The East Cotswold Farmer Cluster. Show me a more advanced and innovative group of farmers in the nature finance arena. Oxbury, we'll hear from Tim in a moment, probably the newest and certainly the most innovative agricultural lender working in the natural capital space. Leverhulme Centre from Oxford University, one of the most locally focused and impactful collection of researchers that we're delighted to be able to work with, and many, many more. Yeah, I haven't outlined the whole of the strategy that we have for this stuff. There's loads of particular projects that are going on in this space in partnership with the LNP. You'll hear from a couple of them in a moment. Yeah, looking forward to Q&A afterwards as well to get into conversation with you all about this stuff. Thanks very much.
Got Tim Coates. There's a nice segue in there, thank you, Matt, for Tim, who's director of the East Cotswold Farmer Cluster. So Tim is a third-generation farmer, a director of the East Cotswold Farmer Cluster and chair of the Evenlode Landscape Recovery project. He is also the co-founder of Oxbury Bank, a dedicated bank for British farmers that is TNFD early adopter and sits on the boards of the Oxfordshire LNP and Silver Sheep. Tim has an MSc in Financial Economics, so we're very pleased to see you here today. Tim.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here in such good company, and I have had such a good framing there from Matt. Thank you, and thank you for the kind words. And only a shame that MSc wasn't from an Oxford institution. Never mind. I'm not bitter 20 years later. I'm here to talk about the collaboration of the North East Cotswold Farmer Cluster, which is about 150 members strong and covers nearly 50,000 hectares in the Cotswold National Landscape and Character area, taking up a large chunk of West Oxfordshire. Our facilitator, Tim Field, is right here. And we often get confused, and that's fine because he knows everything there is to know about nature finance, and I know everything there is to know about hydrology, so it'll be fine. The Evenlode Landscape Recovery project sees farmers working together at a landscape scale to restore the natural environment of the Evenlode catchment. I'm going to talk about how we've built an investable structure for this project that is replicable across the UK to ensure that the 70% of land that is actually managed by farmers is all within scope for investment in nature recovery. A point I'd like to get up front, and indeed I'll come back to it at the end, and it's been trailed by Matt, of course, is the importance of collaborative relationships. Dare I say regenerative relationships, in order to ensure we have the nature recovery we all need in the farming sector and actually for all of us as a society. So our project is centered around the hydrology of the river Evenlode, which is not actually clear from this exactly where the river is on this diagram, but it's the Evenlode rivers, which start up in Moreton Marsh in Gloucestershire and come through Charlbury and down to confluence with the Glyme and the Dawn right here as we reach Oxford, where we are now. So it's the area within this black boundary. Now, the blue is the Cotswold National Landscape, and I'm still getting used to saying that rather than area of outstanding natural beauty. And the red is our farmer cluster members' parcels. So we have the scope both within and without of the catchment to make some real change. And so we have a large footprint as well, also on the Windrush catchment and the Charwell as well, and growing all the time. Our focus for the project is on the immediate 4,000 riparian hectares around the river. But actually the whole catchment, which is about 43,000, is also within scope, potentially. The interventions that we want to do are all about making sure that the farmers are correctly incentivized to work together, 60-odd farmers within the project, but also then achieve that landscape scale outcome. So as such, we've got to incentivize farmers properly. So what in farming circles are known as revenue payments, to sort of use DEFRA's ongoing language, are really, really important here. So that's kind of predictable, ongoing payments that can be taken by farmers over a set time frame. So that's going to be crucial to the model that we've built going forward. Farmers must also be at the table, nature restoration, and appropriately supported. Today actually sees the launch of the Green Finance Institute's, I forget this right, Farming Toolkit for Assessing Opportunities in Nature Markets. That's also been launched today. It's a free resource being put out by the Green Finance Institute to support farmers in understanding nature markets. So they're getting the kind of support that we're all getting today from having these conversations. Quick discussion about some of the interventions, and this is other Tim's specialists, not me, but we've got some really exciting things to do. Everyone's favorite word, re-wiggling, is going to be a big feature of what we want to do on the river. That's the paleo channel, am I right, Tim? Yeah, exactly. Not actually how the river, the Evenlode starts, but that is the head of the Evenlode. And this is a stage 0 floodplain restoration on the Dawn River. Now we had to give these slides in before recent events. It looks a bit different right now, but it's doing amazing work right down there. In terms of allowing the river, which is normally to spill into this floodplain, and that's crucial to what we need to do, and that's work we've already done. You know, we're not waiting. We're getting on and doing things in our catchment collaboratively as farmers to make landscape scale change. So our suite of interventions needs to be sort of hyper-local. It needs to matter at the farm level, from the farm business, the farm context. But it also needs that landscape scale discussion, and it needs the understanding, of course, of not just the one catchment, but the catchments around it and the wider environment in which we all live in. We generate financial return through highly accurate data-backed quantification of the various ecosystem services that are generated by the interventions that we do. So our preferred scenario is both ecologically and economically the most valuable approach, rather than focusing on any one ecosystem service. We're not about chasing carbon capture by itself or just about biodiversity net gain. As Sophos has demonstrated, that is not going to get the necessary funding into this project that is required. But we need to build a flexible approach that allows us to access both current markets and ones that may emerge in time. And we're going to be working very hard to try and build the case for why there should be a natural flood management market, for example. Although we need significant investment to achieve our project, our financial model does predict that there's significant returns to be made over not just a 50-year time period, but actually we think there's significant return on investment well within a decade. A bit of complexity, not quite as complicated as Matt's diagram. But this is sort of the operating model for the project, which would be sort of the Investco. So it's, I say simply, it's a limited liability company guaranteed by share capital, various different classes of shares that are made available to different participants depending on who they are and their own profiles, but also their return expectations. So we anticipate that therefore we will get a blended finance model. I'm using blended finance here to mean different investments made seeking differential returns, rather than talking about sort of sometimes how it's talked about in terms of nature markets. But we expect the participation of government, and we're in discussions with them about exactly the shape of that at the moment. Direct equity investors, we're also in discussions with some of those at the moment. Obviously, farmers appear more than once here, and we need to consult with all of our membership in terms of what their expectations are. The Farmer Cluster, which is structured as a community interest company, is also a participant in the structure. And then, of course, there's the buyers of natural capital, who may be buying it under a variety of mechanisms. Crucially, this actually should make life easier for farmers, self-interestedly there. But actually, that's more about, back to my point, that 70% of the UK land is managed by farmers. So it has to be replicable. It has to be straightforward. We believe this structure actually is quite simple and is recognizable to the farming community. It's recognizable to the investment community. It sees efficient flow of funds to farmers. It takes the reporting burden away from farmers, and it guarantees their participation, ensuring long-term success of a project. We also intend to use a natural capital accounting approach to ensure that this is appropriately sort of demonstrates the true economic value. So with the structure allowing for all types of entities to participate, depending on their required returns, whether those are financial or more than financial, we think there's a bit of logical mapping to types of funders and the sort of time frame under which they might invest and what they will be seeking. So we've already been very much having lots of conversations with and taken some investment from the sort of first 3 to 4 groups there, as we're sort of in the early stages of the project in design and initial interventions before we sort of go live in a big way in almost exactly a year's time. Not all investors want a strict financial return. I think that's come up a couple of times now across the day. They might want something a bit different. So data evidenced outcomes, really important firstly. If you're really interested in water quality, if you are, say, Thames Water, who've got massive obligations in that area, you might want to be able to assume some of the natural capital value onto your own balance sheet if you are highly dependent on the sector. Let's say you're a major food retailer. You may just want a really easy purchase of high integrity credits for offset or inset if you're in a hard to abate or a high impact or a high dependent sector. The point about our structure and approach is we've taken on the challenge of blended finance as a whole to effectively merge all of the different interests, investment horizons, and return expectations together into one asset class approach. There are a range of different financial returns discussed here, but we think they are all achievable depending on the scenario we adopt for the model, which to some extent will be anchored by who the investors are that we attract into the project. We intend that we'll be refinancing this project over its lifetime, so that will change, and therefore the return expectations will also change over time. So in theory, we could target private equity level type returns, and we think that's actually possible under certain scenarios that we've constructed. However, we're much more interested in getting towards the long-term, very patient forms of investment capital. We know the government has a role to play. We'd quite like to help them get out and go and reinvest that money in other similar projects. The other thing that I kind of want to touch on here, although it's not particularly illustrated on this slide, is I think it's really important, as I said, that we build the case for emerging nature markets. So natural flood management, we were a hydrology-led approach. We're going to make massive interventions in wetlands, other freshwater habitats, which are going to give so much in terms of the ecosystem service provision. And frankly, it's up to all of us to go and make the case that everyone who is dependent on those to date has essentially been free riding on that service. If you are a direct beneficiary of cleaner, better regulated water, like the Water Authority or Network Rail or the Highways Agency, then that should be something that is starting to appear on your P&L in your cost side. If you are the insurance industry, you have a role to play in reducing the risk for yourselves, your long-term resilience, but also for us all, and not just free ride on the actions of others. Hopefully the weather recently is going to do a bit of getting everyone to assess that a bit better. There were 4 things that were brought up in a report in May last year from the Green Finance Institute that I'm also going to quickly touch on. These were things that would enable nature finance in the farming environment. So the first was data access. So in our project, we're privileged to be a partner with the Leverhulme Centre at Oxford University to build a world-class data set for our project. And there's been a huge amount of research done on our catchment, which we're bringing together. Secondly, we need to think about economic metrics that are understandable to everyone. So we've actually built a total economic valuation framework that can describe the economic value of the interventions we're going to make in our catchment. We need high integrity markets. And again, as I've described, we've built a range of scenarios that talk to the existing markets, but also future markets, so that we can come up with an approach that evolves with those markets to guarantee returns. And then we need aggregation support and model support and scalability. So we want to showcase our work, so we're doing that today. We will intend to do that more, share openly our legal and financial frameworks in due course to enable the scaling of our approach more widely across the country. As I said earlier, it's clear that we need to build a natural capital asset class that brings all different types of investors with different return profiles and different outcome expectations together. And we think our project can showcase that. In conclusion, our project is quite complex, but then so is nature. There's nothing straightforward. Everything is linked. Heard endogenous a few times today already, so I'll say it again. But yeah, it's very much that kind of feature. This is not something that can be siloed apart. But with complexity comes resiliency. And I think that's one of the great things we need to embrace and understand that we're building something that will be very impactful into the future. We need to align the incentives of all actors. That includes aligning the incentives of a large number of farmers who themselves face challenging circumstances. And Sophos, I'm happy to give you a primer on elms if you'd like one. We need to do that for farm businesses, but actually for our own collective food security, which is only going to be more challenged as we head into the challenges of climate adaptation. So I'd like to give you 3 final takeaways. Firstly, investment at scale through a farmer-led model is both necessary and achievable. It can be replicated with the right structure and the foundations of data, carefully designed outcomes, and a high integrity yet flexible approach. And thirdly, although complex, this approach can meet an array of emerging investor requirements and returns. And the aim is fundamentally to simplify the capital raising approach through a nature asset class. As with Matt, we wouldn't have got to where we've got to today without the partners we've got, who are listed on here. But the most important tool we have as people, as humans, actually is collaboration. That is the human gift to nature. We take everything else from nature. So we must act regeneratively together in restoring our relationships with one another and collaborating with all of these partners that we've done so far and any others that we can hopefully build today. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to hearing from any of you.
Thank you very much, Tim. That was really insightful. So I'd like to introduce now Matthew Morrison-Clarke. So Matt is from BBOWT, with whom we work closely. So that's Berkshire Books and Oxfordshire Wildlife Trust. Matt is the development manager there, where he spearheads the organisation's efforts in environmental markets, particularly biodiversity net gain, and has a focus on acquiring and establishing project sites. Plays a crucial role in fulfilling BBOWT's broader objectives for nature recovery, and Matt's experience in the third sector has equipped him with the skills to attract new income streams, contribute to sustainability. So very pleased to welcome you, Matt, and
So I'm here to present on behalf of BBOWT our habitat banking investment model, which we've applied to the biodiversity net gain market. Fortunately, my slides are quite simple, and the model is quite simple. Downstairs, we heard that finance is quite a simple principle. Fortunately, biodiversity net gain is a regulated market, and even though it's an emerging one, it is still a relatively straightforward model, which I'm going to explain and demonstrate how we've delivered it, or we've worked on it, and we are delivering real live projects. So the development project banking model was worked with funding from NERF, as we referenced earlier on, and it was done in partnership with ourselves and a couple of other wildlife trusts and also Financer. And this is a simple chart, by the way, okay? Because finance is simple. Basically, what we're trying to do is through investing in a habitat bank, it is an offset market that we're doing, but we are looking for investment into a habitat bank to deliver biodiversity outcomes that are measurable ahead of that value being sold to developers. Now, I'm not sure what the level of understanding of BNG is within this room, but basically BNG is a transaction for biodiversity losses through development that can be offset by improving the environments and habitats on the original development site, or they can also be done off-site. And I'm talking about off-site offsetting here. The reason investment is required is because for the benefits of nature, when you're offsetting, it is far better to do biodiversity uplift and habitat creation in advance of the requirement for that offsetting. That involves capital and investment and time. If you have that capital investment and time coming through, you can develop your habitat bank, and you simply then are transacting with developers who require that offsetting. The income generated through you fulfilling their obligations in their planning application generates revenue, comes back into their habitat bank, and then some of that money goes back to the original investment. Some is covering the ongoing operational costs. It's a very simple model. This was developed, say, alongside Cheshire, who were applied the project to a former agricultural site, Warwickshire, who were using repurposing a former golf course, and ourselves in a site that we acquired adjoining one of our nature reserves. So in terms of putting it into real terms, our case study, or our first case study at least, if we are looking at BNG habitat banking, there's probably three main criteria that we would be looking for. The first one is if we're looking for a site, the strategic location is very important. The example I'm demonstrating here is quite a simple one. Strategic location is important because we're looking at nature recovery on a landscape basis. We are looking to focus on sites that will have connectivity to other natural resources and other ecosystem services. And so therefore, strategic location of that site is very important. Our very simple example here is we have a site called Chimney Meadows, which is in the Upper Thames catchment, 300 and so hectares of land, which we've been managing for over 20 years. The site we identified as a potential was Duxford, which is a 40-hectare site, directly lying and bounded by three sides by our own nature reserve. So strategically, relatively simple. Because it's a commercial model, the habitat banking model, size and condition is important. you have to invest in the recovery of nature and the ecosystems on this site. And to make that financially viable, the size of the site is extremely important, as is the condition and the potential for biodiversity uplift on that site. So I'll tell you in a second how we did that, but that's very important. And the third thing is, what is the current use and land value? This site in particular is part of the floodplain. It was being used as a commercial grazing location. It was not generating income for the current landowner, the farmer, because it wasn't really a suitable site for grazing long term. The biodiversity was low because the land had been damaged. And so in terms of the current use and land value to a commercial farmer, that wasn't of much value. But for our objectives, it was perfect. So we identified this quite quickly as a potential for a very successful habitat bank that we could manage over 30 years. I'll just mention this 30-year horizon. It's a regulated market. Where you're doing biodiversity net gain, you have to deliver the outcomes across a minimum horizon of 30 years. And so it's very important that the work you do can be sustained and managed and developed over that period of time. So the site itself, if you remember that area on the previous chart that was yellow, the way we started, after doing a very preliminary assessment, our ecology team basically went to the site and using the metric baseline that Matt referenced earlier on, we did a baseline condition assessment of the habitats and the conditions of those individual habitats on that site. And the second part of that is once you've assessed what is there currently, you've got to predict what you can deliver and generate and create over the forthcoming 30 years. This site was straightforward and simple to ourselves. You may remember we had 300 hectares around it. So we had a perfect reference point of what we'd created previously. And therefore, this void that was sitting in the middle, we could fairly confidently predict what could be developed and restored over time. Secondly, once they've done the baseline and they've identified the potential uplift, our ecology and land management teams would get together and they would draw together a habitat management and monitoring plan to detail exactly how those outcomes will be delivered. And this is a document that has to be submitted to the local planning authority and also Natural England so that you can reference exactly how you're going to achieve this. And because, again, it's a 30-year horizon, this document is quite, it's got to be an adaptive management regime, but it's also going to have sufficient detail in it to explain what you will do to mitigate any issues or any challenges you face during that period. The bit where we go back to the actual banking model and the commercial model is, once you've identified what is required for your project, you then have to cost this. Everything is in basically investment and return. So for us, we had to do a forecast of all of the investment that was required in terms of time, people, equipment, legal fees, professional fees, etc., over a 30-year horizon. That's quite difficult to do. I've never done a 30-year budget, and I doubt many people will ever do a 30-year budget. There are so many factors within that and so many potential risks. If you put every risk within that, you wouldn't undertake the task because there's just no return potentially for that. However, once we've done our internal costings and budgets and structure, we link this back to our work with Finance Earth into a banking model that they've created, which I can't share with you just at this point in time, which again, a bit like the Deframetric baseline, is an Excel-based document. The model that was developed with Finance Earth combines the data set that comes from the metric baseline data that our ecology team deliver, adds that to the predictions of the data and the habitat improvements that will be developed over time and quantifies that outcome as biodiversity units. The model draws those figures and links it to our operational costs for the plan that you are doing over 30 years. The third side, it then also draws in the income potential for you being able to monetize and sell those ecosystem services, those biodiversity units to developers. And by combining and measuring the biodiversity uplift, the operational costs for delivering that, and the return, it generates a genuine and a fairly robust income and expenditure forecast across that 30-year period. So when we talk about finance being simple, the advantage in the biodiversity net gain market is we can demonstrate physical figures that will demonstrate what return can be generated. Pressing the wrong button, obviously. Well, here we go. However, we are a wildlife trust. We're not financiers. We are not business people or what have you. When we manage a range of 86 sites across our 3 counties, whilst we are using Duxford Old River and our next habitat bank as well for generating income and returns for the management of those sites across 30 years, we are also looking at other benefits that have been generated from that site for the benefits of nature. The way the biodiversity net gain market is structured, you cannot monetize most of these. You cannot stack income generated through different services you're generating off the same site. However, as a wildlife trust, in the same way we do for our other nature reserves, we are recording other outcomes from that site because we believe that we're looking at more of a holistic image of what we're trying to create in terms of nature recovery. BNG will finance that work and will finance the project, but our management teams will also look at a much broader vision of what we're trying to achieve out of that site. And ultimately, at some point in time, some of these values or some of these ecosystem services may be monetized, but not within one of our biodiversity net gain habitat sites. So in terms of what our BNG ambition is as a wildlife trust, and it's shared with other wildlife trusts and organizations, is we want to create high quality habitat banks to address the off-site demand for biodiversity net gain. But also importantly, we believe there is a greater opportunity in voluntary markets. In one of Soph's charts from earlier on, BNG is a good market for generating finance and bringing finance into nature recovery, but it's not sufficient. It will only scratch the surface. It is important that we look at generating habitat banks across other markets to attract more income. We want to establish at least 200 hectares across our 3 counties. We're currently sitting at 60 hectares. Our 200 hectares, we will achieve that within the next 3 years, represents about a 10% uplift in our current holding of land. We do, though, because we're a wildlife trust, want to sell units that are more than just BNG. It is important that we are also selling the environmental and social benefits of those sites, because that is more attractive to some of our potential investors, particularly on a voluntary level. And the final thing is, we're looking at the longer term horizon. I did mention 30 years as the minimum. We as a wildlife trust are looking at these sites in perpetuity. We cannot uplift and regenerate and recover nature networks and leave them to hang after 30 years. We have to manage this in perpetuity in the long term. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matt. That was great. So we're now into questions. Who has the first question, please? Yes, please.
Hi. I think you all like spreadsheets, getting that sense from what you just presented. Can I ask our 3 panel to set the vision for Oxfordshire? What can the restoration of land do for for flood risk reduction, for net zero, and for being what might be called a nature positive economy? Can you put some parameters on it, a percentage for what can good management of land do for those 3 goals?
Great, thanks, Bruce. So it's a really good question. I think the first thing to say is that for a vision for nature recovery in Oxfordshire, everybody will have their own ideas for their different bit. But the local nature recovery strategy is a mandatory process through the County Council leading it, with partnership support from many organisations represented here today, that will really define and agree collectively what our desired outcomes and measures are for nature recovery in Oxfordshire. So I think that the creation of that LNRS, the production of that LNRS, will really set out a lot of that. There's a lot of talk about the envelope of 30% of land and water managed for nature. And I think that might be something that goes into our systematic conservation planning prioritisation process within the LNRS. In terms of carbon sequestration and flood, I think it's probably a good idea to hand over to Tim immediately on flood risk. And in terms of carbon, I think there was a piece there Tim mentioned around carbon, not just being a single focus on carbon. And also Matt mentioned whatever the ecosystem service that's being sold, whatever the mechanism for generating revenue from an intervention on a piece of land, whether it's carbon, it's going to have biodiversity benefits unless you're doing wall-to-wall Sitka spruce, and should be designed for that. If it's biodiversity, it's going to have carbon uplift in it. So I don't think we should focus on any particular percentage increase in ecosystem service generation. Moreover, we should look at this as a holistic. Nature recovery does in different places, does many of these different ecosystem services. Just finally, Alison Smith from ECI, from the university, has produced an ecosystem natural capital baseline for Oxfordshire. She's in the process of doing opportunity mapping for the county as well, which the LNP hopes to host that mapping on our website when it's live. And that will also demonstrate a kind of the art of the possible for ecosystem services across the county.
Thank you. Sorry,
I was just going to add, because and I can give you some precise numbers, Bruce, but not right now because they're in my bag and I haven't got them in my head. But we have, we've looked at what the sort of present value of the baseline of where we are today in Oxford, and there's great work done by Alison and Sophos, which has actually put some great quantification on that in terms of the 800 million required for 30 by 30. I think I'm quoting that right. So just in our project, which is sort of, is about, I want to say about 20%, maybe not quite that much of Oxfordshire. So we're in West Oxfordshire predominantly, but also into neighbouring counties. We've got numbers now to talk about what the economic value is today, which is very different from what the market value is. And actually, both of those are probably gross underestimates. They can only be done based on where we think we are today, and those values are going to be actually higher in the future, we hope. And it's sort of in bringing those values together that we realise that there's this opportunity, therefore, that is the investment that enables these things to happen. But I can put some big, different conversations on that for you.
So there's quite a few hands going up. So I think what we'll do is we'll take a few questions, mindful of the time, and then we'll put those to the panel. So those hands again, apologies. I see the gentleman at the back. Yep, and then the orders.
Yeah, thank you for your presentations. I mean, one of the big challenges is whether it's offsets or showing that you're is additionality, showing that you're doing something that wouldn't have happened otherwise. And I think the BBOWT with the 10%, that might be a challenge. Would that site have been regenerated to another means? How can you do this at scale? At much bigger scale. I think the farming cluster, if you're stewards of a whole river catchment, potentially you can show the impact on flooding downstream. I guess, particularly for the BBOWT case, what are the barriers to you doing this at scale so you can overcome that additionality problem?
Just take that next question, if we may. So have a think about who might want to answer that one. Good question, please.
I have two questions. Choose which one you'd like to answer. One would be of what importance or value would be a land management strategy for the whole of the county to ensure joined up. And the other really is about biodiversity net gain as a very flawed representation of what nature really is. And how do you avoid the medical principle which came out earlier about first do no harm? How do you ensure that the sites that are being developed are not presenting a huge loss, both in terms of irreplaceable habitats or connected habitats, or those that provide societal well-being and sense of pressure?
And then just pick up that third question.
When all the 30 years expire, is there a risk that good management falls off a cliff? Anything to be done to deal with that risk?
Who wants to pick up the first question?
Well, I'll jump in. I'll answer all three, and then I'll let these guys do. So the first one, scalability. The reason we like spreadsheets is because we need to attract investment into this area. I need spreadsheets so that I can demonstrate to my trustees, my membership, and our other teams for us to invest our own funds as a small wildlife trust into recovering our habitats. we're not going to be able to do it ourselves. We need everybody else involved too. So the reason we have spreadsheets is because we want scalability. We've got to get more people involved. I don't want to be the only person doing BNG in our counties. I want other people there too. We need more participants, more farm clusters involved. And these guys need support, they need investment too to get them off the ground. In terms of the second question, which was asking about this offsetting, and are you not potentially offsetting something that you should be avoiding or mitigating in the first place? Absolutely. A developer at the moment cannot damage irreplaceable habitats or certain species, and it's the job of the LPA to intervene and prevent them taking those actions when they do their original ecological assessment or what have you. As a wildlife trust, we will not sell or transact any of our biodiversity net gain offsetting to any development which we will specifically disagree. If we have concerns, we will not do it. If they come to us asking us to replace a high distinct evidence habitat, the answer would be no, because they should not be damaging that habitat in the first place. And the third question, in terms of what happens after 30 years, well, here, I don't want this on camera, the good news is that after the 30 years, some of our echoes we're managing in perpetuity. So after 30 years, we've developed a very good, stable, biodiverse ecosystem, and we will continue to manage that as we manage all of our other sites. For other people doing habitat banking who may not have the longer term horizon that we do, they may be trapped by the fact they have inadvertently created a biodiverse habitat in their environment, and through legislation that comes into force in 30 years' time, they may have to protect that moving forward. For what they've established, they've created something that they then have to look after because legislation has come up around them. But we will be doing it anyway.
I'm going to quickly go across all of it. I'll go the other way. So I'll start with the long-term bit. I mean, if you're looking for a type of individual who is used to long-term stewardship land, I think farms are a really good place to start. You know, very often multi-generational businesses with huge roots going into things. So I think that long-term vision is encapsulated in the way that those businesses are often run. So I think that's quite positive. And again, I think there's a big debate going on in farming circles, which is complete nonsense, which is this dichotomy again of food security versus sort of nature and climate. And it needs to just be put in the bin. And you know, the point is you cannot have one without the other. You cannot have food security without nature. And the investment in nature on each individual, and this is the scalability point. Each individual, you know, we kind of want this idea, and I'm not going to pick a number, but you know, let's say 10%. If every farm's going to say we're going to make a 10% investment in our farm for nature, that's it. Now, we need to do that in a much more strategic, sensible way that's hyper sort of local specific to that farm, but there's also makes reference to sort of local nature recovery strategies, etc., and if there aren't nature deserts, all this kind of thing. That's what I'm doing. But you know, if I was, and it's the other point, fundamentally, I think that I don't think it's on the project developers, the wildlife trusts, the farmers, or whoever, to take on some of the burdens around, you know, the enforcement of BNG. You know, I would probably want to be the, I don't know, the leader of the council or something if I wanted to kind of get on and drive that through and, you know, take leadership from a small P or big P political standpoint and say this is what we believe in Oxfordshire as a county council, city council, district councils, etc. In terms of enforcing the legislation that's been given, the market that's been created. And the final point really is then to go back to additionality and scalability. And I think additionality in carbon markets is really important. Additionality, the additionality principle being taken out of that and being used more widely is very dangerous, I think. And I think we'll have to be sort of, it's basically sort of saying that, you know, good actions should not be rewarded. And I think we're going to have to go, you know, evolve from that thinking quite quickly. I expect that to happen as unfortunately the urgency to act becomes ever more apparent.
I'm going to invite a few more questions because there were more hands up over here. So, at a time. Oh, well, we're finished.
We started late.
Unless you want to go for a little bit longer, are we allowed to do that?
We'd love to, but
we're into a break. Are we? We're into a break. We've got 10 minutes. Oh, right. So I mean, if you want to hang around and have a chat with the panel, it's entirely up to you. We're into a break now. You've got 10 minutes, and then they're back into the main room for the main session.